Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, we listen in on a talk given by Ambassador Dennis Ross, former Special Envoy to the Middle East peace process. Ambassador Ross is speaking of his new book, Be Strong and of Good Courage, in which he describes four Israeli leaders who he asserts made decisions for the good of the state rather than their own political benefit. He discusses this in the broader context of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and in particular evaluates the new plan put forward by the Trump administration. Let's join Ambassador Ross in his discussion.
So the premise of the book, it is called Be Strong and of Good Courage. It actually comes from the Bible. In Hebrew, it's Hazak ve'amatz. It's actually, the first time it appears in the Bible is when Moses can't enter the Promised Land, and so he says to Joshua, I can't go in, but basically you're going to have to be strong and of good courage. The title basically is referring to two things. First of all, Israel has to be strong. In the Middle East, if you are not strong, you are dead. Weak is not an option. So you have to be strong. You look at the realities of what Israel faces. You look at 130,000 rockets in Lebanon, Hezbollah rockets. You look at the reality of Iran and the Shia militias embedding themselves within Syria. You look at ISIS in the Sinai. You look at Hamas in Gaza. Basically, everywhere you look, what Israel faces is a real threat. You look at the character of the wars within the region. The war in Syria has probably claimed close to 600,000 dead. We have something right now taking place in northwest Syria where there are, by the UN's account, probably the worst flow of refugees since the start of the war, between 600,000 and 700,000 people, taking place without any notice. This is the Middle East. So if you're not strong, you're not vulnerable, you're dead. So Israel has to be strong. That's not an issue. But Israel also has to be wise. And the premise of the book is that Israel is at a point where if it stays on the path it's on, it will become one state for two people. Now, this is not an argument, it's a reality. If you look at the actual numbers of Israeli Jews to Arabs in the territory that is today the state of Israel and the West Bank, the actual ratio today is about 60-40. 60% Jewish, 40% Arab. You'll hear other numbers from other people where they'll say it's already at parity, but they count Gaza. And Israel got out of Gaza. You can't have it both ways. When Israel withdraws from a place and you still want to count it as being there, then you could argue that when they withdraw, they get no credit for it. So the issue, I don't count Gaza, but 60-40 already. If it stays as it is, that's already one state for two people. And the demographics are such, the birth rates are such that even though the gap in birth rates is not what it once was, within 20 to 25 years, you will have parity. So with the Palestinians, if it becomes clear that there's only one state as an outcome, pretty soon they're going to start saying, okay, fine. One state, one person, one vote. Now, if you think that BDS is a problem for Israel, that will be child's play compared to a Palestinian kind of mantra that is one state, one person, one vote. Israel is then going to be in a very different kind of place. Israel then is going to be wrestling with what kind of a state is it going to be. So the threat to Israel from what they face in the region is quite real. It's tangible. And what I'm describing is a threat to Israel's character, which is far less tangible, but is just as real. Now, one way to ensure that Israel doesn't become one state for two people is for Israel to stop building outside the settlement blocks. Everybody here know what a settlement block is? Everyone who doesn't know what a settlement block is? Okay, so let me explain it. This happens to be something that I know quite well because I helped to come up with the concept before we went to Camp David in the summer of 2000. Before we went to Camp David, we were dealing with what proposals, bridging proposals, might we have to make. And obviously that meant on the core issues like borders. Well, we were looking at the reality that the June 467 lines, what's known as the Green Line, is actually not a defensible border for Israel. So there needed to be an adjustment of that border, but there also were at that time already about 300,000 Israelis who lived beyond the Green Line. And so we focused on, all right, how can we propose a border that is both more realistic from a defensible standpoint and also can deal with the reality of settlers on the other, and at the same time produce something that the Palestinians could ultimately accept. So we came up with the concept of settlement blocks on about 5 to 6% of the West Bank closest to the Green Line, and the concept of territorial swaps. So settlement blocks and swaps, that idea started then. The idea of blocks themselves was actually not hard to come up with because there are 128 settlements that the Israelis have built on the other side of the Green Line. And 80% of the settlers, not the settlements, but 80% of the settlers live in about 5 to 6% of the West Bank. So that's where we came with the reality of how Israelis settled helped to define the very concept of blocks. Just to cement that point for you, I said there's 128 settlements. 5 of the settlements have 45% of the entire population. Right? So the way Israelis settled was in blocks. All right, so everything I've just said so far, if Israel stops building outside the blocks, it preserves itself as one state. I mean, it preserves itself as 2 states, or at least the potential of 2 states. As long as it's building within the blocks, it's consistent with a 2-state outcome. When it's building outside the blocks, it's no longer consistent with a 2-state outcome. Okay, so I've just made the case for how they can preserve themselves, or at least preserve the option of 2 states. And I should just parenthetically say the following. When I'm going through this, understand there's another premise here. The other premise is 2 states as an outcome is not available anytime soon. Now, there's all sorts of reasons for that. I can go through it in great depth, but I'll give you the simplest one. You're aware that the Palestinians are completely divided. So in the West Bank, you have Fatah and the Palestinian Authority. In Gaza, you have Hamas. The simplest way to understand this is until Palestinians can make peace among themselves, they're certainly not capable of making peace with the Israelis, quite independently of who is in charge within Israel. In addition to that, there's complete disbelief between the 2 publics at this point. The gap psychologically and substantively between the 2 sides, honestly, has never been wider. And I say that from the perspective of someone who's worked on this for 30 years. It might be remarkable I say that, particularly when you think about the Second Intifada, where the numbers of deaths on each side were over 1,100 Israelis died, close to 4,000 Palestinians died, and I'm telling you, it's worse today in terms of the gap, psychologically and substantively. So the premise here is 2 states isn't available anytime soon, but also if Israel keeps building outside the blocks, you're going to hit a tipping point. And the tipping point is not that far away, because today there are 104,000 Israelis who live outside the blocks. So this is a book that says, if Israel stays on the path it's on, it becomes 1 state for 2 people. The way to prevent that is to stop building outside the blocks, because what that does, it basically preserves the option of separation. 2 states may not be available anytime soon, but you have to preserve the option of having 2 states later on, or what may be some other variations of that. If you keep building outside the blocks, the ability to physically separate will disappear. And then you only have one outcome, 1 state. And by the way, 1 state in the Middle East, when you go around the Middle East and you look at the states that have separate national identities, ethnic identities, tribal identities, those states are states in constant conflict. You know, what you want is to recreate Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, then have 1 state for Israelis and Palestinians. That's what you will recreate. You will not create peace. You will create an enduring conflict. Okay, so what you've heard so far is a compelling, eloquent presentation of why Israel should, in fact, stop building outside the blocks. I'm convinced. Now, it's so logical, so how come it's not happening? Well, it's not happening because the settler movement in Israel has real political weight. The political weight it has exceeds its actual numbers. And it's not surprising. Anybody who understands anything about coalition politics or coalition governments understands it isn't the biggest party that has the greatest influence in a coalition. It's that party that is capable of bringing a government down. And the settlers, over time, have built even greater political weight than they had before. So now you get, I described be strong, now you get the part about of good courage. Be strong and of good courage, because it takes political courage to be able to do this. Now, what you might ask at this point is, okay, but you just saw the Trump plan. The Trump plan came out, and the Trump plan calls for 2 states. So problem solved, right? Your book turns out to be unnecessary. And I want to be intellectually honest enough to say, if I thought that were true, I would say, damn, I should have had a V8. I should have written that book. I don't know why I did it, but I'll tell you why I did it. The Trump plan, unfortunately, probably makes the outcome I'm concerned about even more likely. And let me explain why. And I'll do it by offering what I call the good news and the bad news. If my wife were here, she always wants me to start with the bad news. But for you, I'm starting with the good news, okay? So the good news. What's the good news? The good news that the Trump administration, for the first time in 3 years, came out and embraced the principle of a 2-state outcome. That's a good thing. A good thing. For the first time, Likud accepted the principle of a 2-state outcome. It's true that after 9/11, in the fall of 2001, Ariel Sharon, who was the prime minister, a Likud prime minister, was the first one in Israel, first ever, to announce the importance of having a Palestinian state. But his party didn't endorse that. Bibi Netanyahu in May of 2009, he also talked about a demilitarized state. But his party didn't endorse that. Now the Likud party has endorsed the principle of a 2-state outcome. That's good. That's significant. There's something else that was good about those who shaped the plan and what they had in mind. They wanted to adjust Palestinian behaviors. They wanted to change the Palestinian attitude that every time they say no to a proposal, they get a better offer next time. Which, by the way, has been the way the Palestinians have thought about it, in part because that's actually been the case. Proposals that were offered always improve what came before. And I was part of that. What we presented at Camp David was much less than what we presented 5 months later with the Clinton parameters. And the answer both times was no. Olmert offered Abu Mazen in 2008 something that went beyond what we offered in the Clinton parameters. And the answer was no answer. In March 17th of 2014, President Obama presented a set of principles that went beyond what we had offered before. Asked for a response in 8 days and never got one. So the idea that you can always say no and you'll get a better offer, reversing that impression was one of the motivators for those shaping the Trump plan. That was also a good thing. Here's the bad thing. If you wanted to lower Palestinian expectations, then you had to present something that was clearly credible. And when I say clearly credible, it means not so much that the Palestinians would immediately embrace it, because, first of all, given their divisions between Hamas and Fatah, that was almost impossible. Given the fact that you have Abu Mazen, who is, depending upon who you ask, including him, he's either 84 or 85. He suffers from hypertension. He has heart issues. And he's an incessant smoker. This is not a prescription for living. So everybody around him is positioning themselves for succession. And that's an environment not that promotes moderation or accommodation. It's an environment that promotes greater purity. So it wasn't that if you offer something of greater credibility, they would embrace it. But you have seismic changes taking place in the Middle East. You have the leading Arab states, the leading Sunni Arab states, who all view Israel as a bulwark against the major threats they face. Iran, the Shia militias, the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. Israel they see as a major bulwark. So the level of their cooperation below the radar screen, because of the Palestinian issue, is unprecedented. It goes beyond what anybody knows. The Israelis don't, for the most part, talk about it, and the leading Arab states don't talk about it, but it doesn't make it any less real or any less strategic, and they believe the Israelis are more reliable than we are. Their view is the Israelis won't leave the region, they're there. So they were actually open to looking for a way to say something positive about the Trump plan. And had the effort been made with them to share the plan in detail and to work out comments that you could take from them to give them some ownership, and to then privately work out word for word what they were going to say in response to the plan, you could have gotten them to say, this is a serious basis for negotiations. They were never going to say the Palestinians need to accept this. They were never going to do that. But they could have said, this is a serious basis for negotiations, if what was offered allowed them to point to things in the plan that was serious. And if you had that worked out with the key Arab leaders, and I say here you're talking about Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Morocco, what's known as the Arab Quintet, if they had said that and you had that in your pocket privately in advance, you could have gone to the Europeans, who would not have been more Arab than the Arabs. And if you had the Arabs and the Europeans both saying that the Trump plan was a serious basis for negotiations, even if we have questions, if they'd been able to say that, then it would have put Abu Mazen in an impossible position. The Palestinians believe the only thing they've ever achieved is international acceptance of their cause. If you put that at risk, then you're jeopardizing the one thing that they perceive they've achieved. That's the one way you will move them. Unfortunately, the administration didn't share the plan in detail. When the Arab leaders saw the map, they saw the map the same time everybody else did. When you look at the map, as one senior Arab official said to me, we wanted to say something positive. But when we looked at the map, there was no way we could stand up and say this was defensible as a state. If we had the map here, I will describe it to you. The Palestinians will get 66% of the West Bank. For historians, anybody here heard of the Allon Plan? This was from 1970. This is the Allon Plan minus. 66% of the West Bank, but it's not cohesive. It's not a contiguous 66%. It's divided up. And why is it divided up? Because when I talked about not building outside the blocks, every single one of the Israeli settlements, and there are 77 outside the blocks. Remember I said build only in the blocks? 77 settlements outside. All 77 are absorbed into Israel. 62 of those divide up the mass that would be the 66% that would be the Palestinian state. So what you get are like splotches. And the only reason you have splotches is because you have to accommodate these 62. Now there's another 15 that will be within the Palestinian state itself. Some people can say legitimately, okay, well, why can't Jews be living in a Palestinian state if there are Arabs who live in Israel? And the answer is you could have that. The difference is the Arabs who live in Israel are Israeli citizens. And in the plan, the Israelis who are there in what would be the Palestinian state, they remain Israeli citizens. So the ability to look at this and say that this is a credible basis isn't there for Arab leaders. The manifestation that things are different from the way they used to be is that the Arab leaders themselves and the Arab states have not come out themselves critically. They haven't criticized the plan. They haven't commented on it at all. Instead, what they say is there ought to be direct negotiations. Now, when you had the Arab League meet and the OIC meet, which is the organization, this is the organization that brings together all the Muslim states, they offered very tough criticisms. You create in these institutions, these are the lowest common denominator institutions, so it's not a surprise they were highly critical. But you don't have any Arab leader coming out and saying the plan is a serious basis. In fact, basically you have silence from the Arab leaders. The only thing they offered was there should be direct negotiations. Itself is an indication of change, that they would be arguing for direct negotiations. So the upshot of this is that the plan as it's constituted now is going to make one state more likely, not less likely. because there isn't going to be action on it. There are things that the administration could do. It could emphasize what the president said when he presented. This is a vision, not a plan. If it's a vision, by definition, it's not fixed in concrete. It can be adjusted. They could emphasize no annexation, no unilateral annexation by the Israelis, because it's a vision and we're talking about a 4-year clock for the Palestinians. Now, the administration has succeeded in preventing Bibi from annexing before the Israeli election. We can get into what the implications may be for after the election. But the reality at this point is, unless there is more done to give life to this by calling it a vision, by preventing annexation, and by actually beginning to act on the economic side of this vision so that Palestinians actually see what they gain. One other point, just to put this in perspective, Palestinians gain nothing until after they fulfill all of the obligations built into the plan. One of which is they have to disarm Hamas in Gaza. Well, Egypt can't do that. Israel's not willing to do it, but they're supposed to do it before they get anything. So, as constituted, it makes one state more likely. And that brings me back to the book. What a brilliant segue. So it brings me back to the book. So, if what is required is an Israeli leadership that is going to do something that's hard, why not look at past Israeli leaders who've done that, who were shaped by that? So this book offers a kind of profiles and courage of Israeli leaders. It doesn't defend every decision they make, but the 4 profiles that are offered in depth are about David Ben-Gurion, about Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Rabin, and Ariel Sharon. Now, these 4 were ideologically different. In the case of Begin and Ben-Gurion and Begin were truly bitter enemies. Ben-Gurion in Knesset debates would never recognize Begin by name. He would say the person sitting next to. They were enemies before the foundation of the state. They remained enemies after the foundation of the state. In the case of Rabin and Sharon, they both spent their careers in the military. They had a lot of commonalities, but they were very different personalities. In the case of Rabin was incapable of telling a lie. He was the most intellectually honest person I ever knew. I've said this before. I've worked for leaders. I've worked with leaders. I never had one of our leaders tell me I was right and they were wrong. This is the way it works. But Rabin, who was the most analytical leader I ever dealt with, when you argued with him, if he'd thought it through, you couldn't move him. If the reality proved that he was wrong, he would say, you were right and I was wrong. So he couldn't lie. He couldn't lie to himself. And when I say he couldn't lie, I can say that Sharon did not have that problem. Sharon understood something that all of them understood. In fact, I will say while they were different ideologically and they were clearly different personalities, what they had in common was a common view of leadership. They understood the attributes and requirements of leadership the same way. All of them felt that the responsibility for making decisions was on their shoulders. They had a responsibility not to avoid decisions, not to defer them for their successors, but to face up to the challenges and make the decisions, even if it was going to be costly. They understood the difference between the costs of action, but also the costs of inaction. They understood what responsibility meant, not just to make a decision, but to bear the responsibility for the decision. I don't know, many of you in this audience will remember Entebbe. Many of you probably will not remember Entebbe. But Entebbe was a case of a hijacking of an El Al plane to Uganda, several thousand kilometers away. Israelis on it, non-Israeli Jews were on it, and non-Jews who were on it. And Israel sends a commando force to rescue them, and it succeeds. Only one person dies. It happens to be Bibi Netanyahu's brother, who is the leader of the commando group. Rabin is prime minister then, first time he's prime minister. When the commandos are in the air, he writes 2 statements to be released after the completion of the mission. One statement explains the success of the mission, the other statement announces his resignation. That's who these guys were. They assumed responsibility. They were prepared to take on their political bases. They put the state first. Menachem Begin, when he makes the decision to do the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, and it means, after Camp David, it means 100% withdrawal from the Sinai. It means the dismantling of the settlements that are there. They may not have been large in number or in population, but the truth is they represented a kind of precedent. For those who were his own political base, this was anathema. They said, you're creating this precedent, first of 100%, secondly, you're taking down settlements, and they didn't like his autonomy plan. His autonomy plan, they described as a slippery slope to a Palestinian state. He gets up in the Knesset to defend it against them, and he says, we will not become Rhodesia. He is challenged by the people who are closest to him, the people who were in the Irgun, the underground with him. And his choice is to address his political base or to do what he thinks is right with the country. He puts the state first. When Sharon makes a decision to withdraw from Gaza and dismantle the settlements there, he's the guy who built them. He creates all the settlements, the grid for the settlements. If you look at the grid he creates in 1977, when Begin is first elected as Likud, it's stunning in terms of what, in fact, is then carried out. He shapes it from there. But he does it for security reasons, as he understands security. He doesn't do it for ideological reasons. So when he becomes the prime minister and he comes to the conclusion that Israel needs to take this initiative, he does it because he says this is a way to preserve who we are. Rabin tells me in February of 1995 that he's going to build a separation fence. He says, I want to reach an agreement with the Palestinians, but I know that we may not be able to reach an agreement with them, and so I'm going to create a separation so we preserve who we are. All four of them put the state first. All four of them understood they had to lead their publics, not follow their publics. They put an emphasis on education of their publics. They did not shy away from doing what was hard. In writing this book, the aim was to show their historical example and to be a source of inspiration for Israel's leaders today, to be prepared to face up to what you have to do, to preserve the identity of the state, the character of the state. Now, because the book opens with Sharon and me having lunch, and Sharon, I will say, was a prodigious eater. For those of you who watched me last night, I do like to eat. I was a minor leaguer compared to him. He brought in, for the two of us, he brought in 10 shawarma sandwiches that were literally this big. Now, I ate 2, and then I surrendered. He ate 8. He got to look the way he did, the old-fashioned way. He earned it. But in that meeting, this is how the book opens, in that meeting, he said to me, all my successors are politicians. And what he meant by that is they'll make political decisions. They won't put the state first. We were talking about the withdrawal from Gaza, and I had written something that he didn't like because I had said, look, I get making the statement about withdrawing. I get that. But why don't, there's 2 problems with it. One, you're going to reward Hamas. Why not declare you're going to withdraw, but the Palestinian Authority has to assume responsibility, security responsibility, so it'll be a phased withdrawal over time as they assume their responsibility. So you don't want to show that Hamas's way worked by forcing you out, and you do want to show that Palestinians also have responsibilities, and Israel isn't the only one that has responsibilities. And he came back and said something very poignant. He said, I cannot let their irresponsibility determine our destiny. His presumption was, they may never be responsible, and if I follow your approach, I'm stuck there, and we're stuck there, and we lose our character. The very last meeting he had before his first stroke was with a group to focus on the demographic issue. The very last meeting. It happens to be a group I'm associated with. So all 4 of these leaders showed who they were. In the last chapter of the book, because if he's right, and I'm not saying he was right, but realizing that if there are political considerations and not the same kind of inspiration of these four, in the last chapter, I lay out what it is that the U.S. could do to make it easier from a political standpoint for an Israeli government to go ahead and make the decisions that I think they have to make. I still have a lot of faith that the right thing will be done, but then again, I've worked on the Israeli-Palestinian issue for the last 30 years, so take what I say with a grain of salt. Okay.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.